There was a window on Maple Street where a boy used to wait. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops of Manchester, 8-year-old Thomas Harrow would climb onto the wooden stool his father had built for him, press his small palms against the cold glass, and watch the street below. He watched the milkman's cart rattle past. He watched Mrs. Pemberton from next door sweep her porch. He watched the shadows grow long and the lamplighter make his rounds. But most of all, he watched for a man in uniform, his father. Captain William Harrow had left for the war in the spring of 1943. Thomas remembered the day. With the kind of clarity that only children possess, the rough wool of his father's coat, the smell of tobacco and shaving soap, the way his father's hand had rested on his head, heavy and warm. "I'll be back before the leaves fall." "Tommy," his father had said, kneeling to meet his son's eyes, "you keep watching that window for me, yeah? And when you see me coming down that street, you run as fast as you can, and I'll catch you. Just like always." Thomas had nodded, too choked with tears to speak. That was 18 months ago. Now it was October 1944, and the leaves had fallen twice. They crunched underfoot on Maple Street, collected in damp piles against the garden walls, turned to mulch in the autumn rain. And still, Thomas waited. His mother, Eleanor, tried to pull him away from the window sometimes. "Come have your supper, love," she'd say softly, her voice threadbare with exhaustion. "It's getting cold." But Thomas would shake his head, his eyes never leaving the street. "Not yet, Mum. What if he comes and I'm not watching? What if he thinks I forgot?" Eleanor would turn away then, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other clutching the edge of the kitchen table. She hadn't told Thomas about the letter that arrived 3 weeks ago. The one with the official seal. The one that began, "We regret to inform you." She couldn't. Not yet. Not when hope was the only thing keeping her son's heart beating. The neighbors whispered, "Of course." They always did. Mrs. Pemberton had stopped asking about William. Mr. Griffiths, who'd lost his own son at Dunkirk, would tip his hat to Eleanor in the street but say nothing. Grief was a language they all spoke now, a silent fellowship of empty chairs and unanswered prayers. But Thomas didn't understand their pitying looks. He didn't understand why his mother cried herself to sleep. He only understood one thing. His father had made a promise, and his father never broke promises. On this particular evening, as Thomas took his place at the window, the street was quieter than usual. A light rain had begun to fall, misting the glass, blurring the world beyond into soft gray shapes. Thomas wiped the condensation away with his sleeve, leaving streaks across the pane. "Come on, Dad," he whispered. "Where are you?" Behind him, Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching her son with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. In her apron pocket, her fingers traced the folded edges of the letter she'd read 100 times. "Missing in action," it said. "Presumed dead. Presumed." The word was both a mercy and a curse. It left room for miracles. It left room for agony. Thomas pressed his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging the window. Somewhere across the channel, in the mud and smoke of a war he couldn't comprehend, his father had fought, had fallen, had perhaps, in his final moments, thought of this very window, this very boy, this promise he couldn't keep. But Thomas didn't know that. All he knew was the waiting. And so he waited. William Harrow had been a steady man. Not the kind of soldier you'd put on a recruitment poster. No chiseled jaw or heroic posture. He was 34, a factory foreman before the war, with calloused hands and a quiet way of moving through the world. But he had something that made men follow him. He kept his word. In the spring of 1943, when the call came for experienced men to join the push into Europe, William could have stayed home. He had a son, a wife, a reserved occupation, but he'd seen the newsreels, heard the stories from France, from Poland, from places whose names stuck in his throat like ash. He'd looked at Thomas, playing with toy soldiers on the living room floor, and thought, not for him, not this world, so he'd enlisted. The training had been brutal. Weeks of cold rain and colder commands, nights spent in barracks that smelled of damp wool and fear. But William endured. He thought of Eleanor's letters, which arrived faithfully every week, filled with small news. Thomas had lost a tooth. The garden was coming in nicely. Mrs. Pemberton's cat had kittens. He thought of Thomas at the window. By June 1944, William was in Normandy. The beaches were worse than anything the training had prepared them for. The sound alone, shells screaming overhead, the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire, men crying out in languages that meant the same thing in every tongue. Help, Mother God, William had pressed himself into the sand, tasted salt and blood, and somehow, impossibly, moved forward. He'd survived D-Day, then the hedgerows, then the grinding house-to-house nightmare of Caen. His unit, what remained of it, pushed east through the summer and into autumn. They liberated villages where old women wept and pressed bread into their hands. They buried boys who'd never shaved. They learned to sleep through artillery and wake at the snap of a twig. William wrote letters when he could, short ones, careful not to frighten Eleanor or Thomas with the truth. "We're making progress," he'd write. "I think of you every day. Keep watching for me, Tommy. I'll be home soon." He meant it. Every word. In late September, his unit was ordered to advance on a German position near the Belgian border. A supply depot intelligence said was lightly defended. It wasn't. The moment they broke from the tree line, the world erupted. Mortars, rifle fire. The earth itself seemed to explode beneath them. William hit the ground, shouting orders. "Fall back! Fall back to the tree line!" But Private Davies, a kid from Liverpool who'd joined just after his 18th birthday, was caught in the open, frozen with fear. William saw him, saw the terror in the boy's eyes, the way his hands shook as he gripped his rifle. William didn't think. He ran. Bullets chewed the ground around him. He grabbed Davies by the collar, dragged him toward cover. Almost made it. The shell hit 3 feet away. William felt the world lift him up and slam him down. His ears rang with a high, endless whine. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on his back, staring at a sky the color of old coins. His left leg was wrong, bent at an angle that didn't exist in nature. Pain arrived in waves, each one higher than the last. Someone was screaming his name. Hands pulled at him. The sky tilted, and then he was moving, bouncing on a stretcher. Trees flashing overhead like cards being shuffled. The field hospital was chaos. A converted barn packed with wounded. The smell of antiseptic barely masking the stench of gangrene. A surgeon, sleeves rolled up, red to the elbows, examined William's leg. "We'll have to take it," he said. No preamble, no comfort, just fact. William grabbed the man's wrist. "Will I live? Probably. If infection doesn't set in, then do it." They gave him ether. As the world faded, William's last conscious thought was of Thomas at the window, waiting. "I promised," he thought. "I promised." The surgery saved his life. But 2 days later, when the infection came anyway, raging through his blood like fire through paper, there was nothing more they could do. William Harrow died on October 2nd, 1944, in a Belgian barn that smelled of hay and death. His last words, whispered to a chaplain who held his hand, were, "Tell my boy I tried." The letter reached Eleanor 3 weeks later. Eleanor Harrow had always been strong. She'd survived the Depression, raised a child while William worked double shifts, kept the household running on rations and resourcefulness. But this was different. This was a grief that had weight, that pressed down on her chest until she couldn't breathe, that turned every morning into an act of violence against her own heart. She'd read the letter alone, late at night, after Thomas had finally fallen asleep at his post by the window. The official language, regret to inform, missing in action, presumed dead, felt like words from another world, cold and sterile, incapable of containing the enormity of what they meant. William was gone, the man who'd held her hand on their wedding day, who'd cried when Thomas was born, who'd built that damn stool for their son to wait on. Gone. But how did you tell a child that? How did you take hope, the purest, most fragile thing in the world, and crush it under the weight of truth? Eleanor tried. She rehearsed it in her mind 100 different ways. "Tommy, darling, I need to tell you something about your father." Or, "Sweetheart, sometimes soldiers don't come home." Or simply, "He's dead, love. He's not coming back." But every time she opened her mouth, every time she looked at Thomas's face, still soft with childhood, still bright with faith, the words died in her throat. So she said nothing. Days turned into weeks. Thomas waited at the window. Eleanor watched him wait. The house became a mausoleum of unspoken truth, heavy with the things they didn't say. Mrs. Pemberton came by with a casserole and quiet condolences. "I heard about William," she whispered at the door. "I'm so terribly sorry, dear." Eleanor accepted the dish with numb hands. "Thank you. Have you told the boy?" Eleanor shook her head. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes were kind, but firm. "You'll have to, love. Eventually. I know. But knowing and doing were different countries, separated by an ocean of fear." At night, Eleanor would lie in bed, the bed she'd shared with William, now vast and cold, and imagine how it had happened. Had it been quick? Had he suffered? Had he thought of them at the end? The not knowing was its own special torture, a wound that couldn't heal because it had no edges, no shape, nothing to stitch closed. She took on extra shifts at the munitions factory. Anything to exhaust herself, to spend the long hours not thinking, not feeling. But every evening, when she returned home, there was Thomas. Always at the window, always waiting. "Any day now, Mum," he'd say with heartbreaking confidence. "I bet he'll be on the next train." Eleanor would smile, or try to. "Maybe, love." The neighborhood children had started to whisper. She'd overheard them once playing in the street. "Tommy's dad is dead," one said matter-of-factly. "He is not," Thomas had shouted, his small fists clenched. "He's coming home!" he promised. The other children had scattered, unsure how to respond to such naked conviction. Thomas had returned to his window, trembling with anger and fear he didn't fully understand. By late October, the first frost came. The window where Thomas waited developed a thin skin of ice in the mornings, which he'd scrape away with his fingernails, determined not to let anything obscure his view. Eleanor made the decision on a Tuesday. She couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't watch her son wait for a ghost. Couldn't live in this limbo between hope and truth. Thomas deserved to know, deserved to grieve, deserved to begin, however impossibly, to heal. That evening, when Thomas took his place on the stool, Eleanor sat down beside him. She took his small hand in hers. "Tommy," she began, her voice barely steady, "we need to talk about your dad." Thomas looked at her, his eyes, William's eyes, wide and suddenly afraid. "What about him?" Eleanor took a breath. "Sweetheart, sometimes in war things happen, things we can't control. And sometimes soldiers," she stopped, because Thomas was staring past her, out the window, his entire body rigid. "Mum," he whispered. "Mum, there's someone coming." Eleanor turned and saw a figure, distant but distinct, walking up Maple Street. The man walked with a limp. Eleanor saw it immediately, the way he favored his left side, the careful placement of each step. He wore a military uniform, though it hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost weight. A kit bag was slung over one shoulder. Thomas pressed against the window, his breath coming in short gasps. "Is it... Mum, is it..." Eleanor's heart was a stone in her chest. It couldn't be. The letter had said, but hope, that terrible, resilient thing, unfurled in her chest despite everything. The man drew closer. The street lamp caught his face. Eleanor saw it clearly now. Thin, weathered, shadowed with exhaustion. Not William. The features were wrong, the build different. Not William. "No," she breathed, relief and disappointment colliding. "No, Tommy, that's not..." But Thomas had already scrambled off the stool, already thrown open the front door. Eleanor reached for him, but he was too fast, flying down the steps and into the street. "Dad," he shouted. "Dad, you're home!" "Thomas, wait!" The man stopped, turned, and Eleanor saw his face clearly now, saw the confusion, then the dawning understanding, then something that looked like pain. Thomas skidded to a halt a few feet away, his smile faltering. You're not my dad." "No, son," the man said gently. His voice was rough, northern. "Yorkshire, maybe." "I'm not." Eleanor reached them, pulling Thomas back against her. "I'm sorry," she said to the stranger. "He's been waiting, we thought..." She couldn't finish. The man's eyes, kind eyes, sad eyes, moved between them. "It's all right." He shifted his weight, wincing. "Are you Mrs. Harrow?" Eleanor's blood turned cold. "Yes, how did you..." "My name's Lieutenant James Cooper," he said. He set down his kit bag and reached into his coat. "I served with your husband, Captain Harrow. He pulled out a letter, worn and creased. "He asked me to bring this to you, if anything happened to him. And to tell you..." His voice cracked. "To tell you he tried. He tried to come home. The world tilted. Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't think." Thomas's hand gripped her skirt. "Is my dad dead?" Thomas asked, the words small and sharp as broken glass. Cooper looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he knelt down, bringing himself to Thomas's level despite the obvious pain it caused him. "Yes, son. I'm sorry. He died a hero, trying to save one of our men. He was the bravest man I ever knew." Thomas stared at him. The color had drained from his face. "But he promised. I know. He said he'd come home." "He said..." Thomas's voice rose, desperate. "He promised!" Cooper's jaw worked. When he spoke again, his voice was thick. "Sometimes, Tommy, sometimes keeping our promises isn't up to us. Your father wanted nothing more than to walk up this street and see you at that window. Every day, he talked about you. Every single day. But the war..." He stopped, struggling. "The war doesn't care about promises." Eleanor felt her knees give. She sat down hard on the cold pavement, pulling Thomas into her lap. He was sobbing now. Great, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear out of his small body. "He promised, Mum. He promised. I know, baby." "I know." Cooper stood, wiping his eyes roughly. He held out the letter. He wrote this, the night before he died. He wanted you to have it. Eleanor took it with shaking hands. The envelope was creased, stained with mud, and what might have been blood. Her name was written across the front in William's careful handwriting. "There's something else," Cooper said. He reached into his kit bag and pulled out a small wooden box. He carried this with him. Every mission. Said it reminded him why he was fighting. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. Eleanor and Thomas, taken the summer before William left. They were laughing at something outside the frame, faces bright with joy. William had kept it all the way to the end. "I was with him," Cooper said quietly. "At the end, he wasn't in pain. And he was thinking of you. Both of you." Eleanor couldn't speak, could barely see through the tears. Cooper straightened. "I should go. I needed to deliver this. Needed to tell you that your husband was the best of us." He saluted, sharp and respectful. "I'm sorry for your loss." He turned to leave. "Wait," Eleanor called. Where is he buried?" Cooper looked back. "Belgium. There's a Commonwealth cemetery near Ypres. When the war's over, you'll be able to visit." Thomas lifted his head from Eleanor's shoulder. His face was blotched with tears, his voice broken. "Will he know we came? If we visit?" Cooper smiled sadly. "I think he will, son. I think he will." He walked away down Maple Street, his limp pronounced in the gathering dark. Eleanor and Thomas sat on the cold pavement, holding each other, holding the letter, holding the shattered pieces of a promise that couldn't be kept. Above them, the window where Thomas had waited so long stood empty now, finally, forever empty. Eleanor didn't open the letter that night. She couldn't. It sat on the kitchen table while she put Thomas to bed, a process that took hours, punctuated by his quiet crying, by questions she couldn't answer. Why did he leave? Why didn't he try harder? Why did he break his promise? Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, and he fell asleep with his face pressed into his pillow, one hand clutching the photograph from the wooden box. Only then did Eleanor return to the kitchen. Only then did she light a candle, sit down, and with trembling fingers, open the envelope. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I've failed you. Failed to keep the promise I made when I left. I'm so sorry. I know Tommy will be angry. I know he'll feel betrayed. Tell him, please tell him, that I fought every day to come home. Every single day. That when the worst moments came, when I thought I couldn't take another step, I closed my eyes and saw him at that window. Saw you both. And it gave me strength. I don't know if what we're doing here matters in the grand scheme of things. I don't know if my death will change anything. But I know this. I died trying to protect a boy who reminded me of Tommy, and I'd make that choice again. Tell our son that promises aren't always about keeping your word. Sometimes they're about keeping your character. I promised to come home, yes. But more than that, I promised to be a man he could be proud of. A father who taught him that some things, honor, courage, protecting those who can't protect themselves, matter more than our own lives. I hope I was that man. I hope, when he's old enough to understand, he'll forgive me. Eleanor, my love, raise him to be strong. Raise him to be kind. Don't let this war make him bitter. Let him remember that his father loved him more than anything in this world. That every day I was away, every moment of fear and cold and horror, was made bearable by the thought of him. Of you, I'm sorry I won't see him grow up. Won't teach him to shave or drive or choose a good woman to love. But you'll do it. I know you will. You're stronger than me. You always were. Look after each other. Remember me. And please, please, don't let Tommy spend his life waiting at windows for things that can't come back. All my love forever. William. Eleanor read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, pressed it to her lips, and wept until there was nothing left inside her but a hollow, aching space where her heart used to be. The weeks that followed were dark. Thomas stopped going to school, stopped eating properly. He'd sit for hours in his room, not at the window anymore, but turned away from it, as if he couldn't bear to look at the place where his hope had died. Eleanor grieved differently, through motion, through work, through the mechanical routines of survival. She wrote to the War Office, requesting information about visiting William's grave. She accepted condolences from neighbors with a smile that never reached her eyes. She packed away William's clothes, his books, the toolbox he'd used to build Thomas's stool. But she kept the letter, and the photograph. And the stool. Christmas came. They didn't celebrate. What was there to celebrate? The tree remained undecorated. The presents remained unbought. They sat together by the fire on Christmas Eve, saying nothing, feeling everything. "Mom," Thomas said finally. "Yes, love? Do you think Dad knew that he wasn't coming home?" Eleanor thought about this. I think he hoped he would. But I think he also knew there was a chance he wouldn't. That's Why he wrote the letter. I'm angry at him. I know, but I miss him. I know that too. Thomas looked at her with eyes older than they should be. He broke his promise. No, Eleanor said firmly. He didn't. He promised to be your father, a good father. And he was, right up until the end. Some promises, Tommy, some promises we keep by trying. Even if we fail, it was a small comfort. But it was something. The years passed. Slowly, painfully, the Harrows learned to live with the absence. Thomas returned to school, grew taller, learned to smile again, though never quite as easily as before. He started working in his teens, helping Eleanor with the bills. They never spoke much about William, but his presence remained. In the photograph on the mantel, in the letter Eleanor kept in her dresser, in the lessons he'd taught Thomas before he left. In 1947, when travel to the continent became possible again, Eleanor and Thomas made the journey to Belgium. They found the cemetery, row upon row of white crosses stretching across green fields toward a horizon that seemed to hold all the sorrow in the world. William's grave was simple. Just his name, his rank, his dates, Captain William Harrow, 1909-1944. Beloved husband and father. Thomas, now 12, laid a single flower on the stone. I forgive you, Dad, he whispered, for breaking your promise, and thank you for keeping it. Eleanor knelt beside him, placed her hand on the cold marble. We're all right, my love, she said. Your boy is growing up strong, growing up to be like you. They stayed until sunset, two figures among hundreds of graves, holding on to each other as the light faded. When they returned to Manchester, Thomas did something Eleanor never expected. He took his father's old stool, the one he'd waited on for so long, and placed it by the window again. Not to wait anymore, but to remember, to honor the promise that was kept in the only way that mattered. Years later, when Thomas had a son of his own, he told him about the grandfather he never met, about a man who built a stool for waiting, who fought a war he didn't start, who died trying to protect someone else's son. He told him about promises and sacrifice, about hope and heartbreak, about the window on Maple Street where a boy once waited. And he taught him this, that some promises are kept not in their completion, but in their attempt. That love isn't measured by what we receive, but by what we're willing to give. That the greatest inheritance a father can leave isn't wealth or comfort, it's character. William Harrow never walked up Maple Street again, never caught his son running toward him, never lived to see the man Thomas became. But in every choice Thomas made, every kindness he showed, every moment he chose courage over comfort, William Harrow came home after all, not to a window, but to a legacy. If this story moved you, remember those who never came home. Honor their sacrifice by living with the character they died protecting. Share this so their memory lives on. And if you have a story of your own, of someone who promised and fought and loved, leave it in the comments below. Let's keep their light burning.